York, this is Democracy Now!
To not allow a witness, a document, no witnesses, no documents in an impeachment trial is a perfidy. It's a grand tragedy, one of the worst tragedies that the Senate has ever overcome.
The Republican-controlled Senate appears poised to acquit President Trump after rejecting a call for witnesses in the historic impeachment trial. The trial resumes today. The president's expected to be acquitted on Wednesday. We'll get the latest. But we begin in Iowa. As the first caucus of the 2020 race takes place, the Democratic National Committee is being accused of taking steps to hurt the chances of Senator Bernie Sanders from winning the nomination.
We are taking on the entire political establishment, both the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment.
Plus, we look at how President Trump has expanded his travel ban to 6 more countries, including Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa. Then, Trump has sabotaged America's response to the coronavirus pandemic. That's the headline of the latest piece by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett. She'll join us in studio. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. House impeachment managers and President Trump's defense team are giving closing arguments in his historic impeachment trial today as the Senate appears set to acquit President Trump later this week. The Republican-controlled body quashed the Democratic effort to call witnesses and introduce new evidence in the trial in a 51-49 vote Friday. Senators Mitt Romney of Utah and Susan Collins of Maine were the only 2 Republicans who voted in favor of calling witnesses. The Senate will hold a final vote on the 2 articles of impeachment Wednesday. Democrats slammed their Republican counterparts following Friday's vote. This is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
To not allow a witness, a document, no witnesses, no documents in an impeachment trial is a perfidy. It's a grand tragedy, one of the worst tragedies that the Senate has ever overcome. America will remember this day, unfortunately, where the Senate did not live up to its responsibilities, where the Senate turned away from truth and went along with a sham trial.
Voting in the 2020 presidential election kicks off today with the Iowa caucuses. Candidates spent the weekend making last-minute appeals to voters in what appears to be a tight race. This is Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders addressing his supporters on Sunday.
We are taking on the entire political establishment, both the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment. We are taking on Wall Street and the insurance companies and the drug companies and the fossil fuel industry and the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex and the whole damn 1%.
In more news about the 2020 elections, the Democratic National Committee is coming under fire after overhauling debate requirements to eliminate the need for candidates to obtain a significant number of small donations, allowing billionaire Mike Bloomberg to take part in upcoming debates, even though he does not have widespread grassroots support. Meanwhile, Politico is reporting DNC members are discussing rule changes that are designed to stop Bernie Sanders from clinching the Democratic nomination by giving superdelegates even more power. We'll have more on the Iowa caucuses as well as impeachment after headlines with The Nation's John Nichols. In immigration news, President Trump dramatically expanded his travel ban Friday. Nationals of Nigeria, Eritrea, Burma, Kyrgyzstan will no longer be able to obtain visas to live and work in the United States, while Sudan and Tanzania will no longer be able to participate in the diversity visa lottery program. The ban, commonly referred to as the Muslim ban, already affects citizens from Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Venezuela, and North Korea. Democrats say they will challenge the expansion and are expected to introduce the No Ban Act in Congress soon. We'll have more on this with the ACLU's Omar Jadwat later in the broadcast. The coronavirus outbreak continues to spread, with the death toll in China now topping 360 and over 17,000 confirmed cases of the infection worldwide. On Saturday, a 44-year-old man in the Philippines became the first casualty of the coronavirus outside China. China. The United States has declared a public health emergency and is barring foreign nationals who have recently traveled to China from entering the country. U.S. citizens who have visited Hubei province, the epicenter of the outbreak, will be quarantined when re-entering the U.S. The Shanghai stock market plunged 8% today. On Thursday, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross appeared to welcome the disease as a boost to the U.S. job market, saying in a Fox News interview it would, quote, accelerate the return of jobs to North America, unquote. Questions are being raised about the handling of the disease by Chinese authorities, who critics say delayed their response and downplayed the severity of the problem. And the local Red Cross in Hubei has come under fire for failing to distribute essential medical supplies to hospitals that need it most. Meanwhile, Chinese and Asian communities in countries including France and Canada say they've been the target of increased racism since the outbreak. We'll speak with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett later in the broadcast. In Syria, Doctors Without Borders says multiple hospitals have been destroyed or damaged amidst a Russian-backed Syrian government offensive against the northwestern province of Idlib. Nearly 250,000 civilians have been forced to flee toward the Turkish border as the Syrian regime aims to recapture one of the last rebel-held territories in Syria. This is Jenna, one of the displaced civilians.
I felt sadness. I lived in Marat and had friends there who were targeted by a plane and died. I cried as I left when the regime took over. I hope its people will be able to return one day and that we will be able to go back to Ghouta. This is injustice.
Thousands of protesters took to the streets of the occupied Palestinian territories Friday to condemn President Trump's so-called Middle East peace plan. Israeli soldiers deployed rubber bullets and tear gas canisters against demonstrators. The Palestinian Authority has announced it's cutting all ties with the United States and Israel in protest of the proposal, which gives Israel even more sovereignty over occupied territories. The Arab League said Saturday it also rejects the U.S. plan. In Iraq, protesters took to the streets across Iraq this weekend following the appointment of a new Prime Minister, Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi. In November, massive anti-government demonstrations ousted the former Iraqi Prime Minister, Adel Abdel-Mahdi. But protesters say Alawi, the former communications minister, is part of the same corrupt political establishment they've been protesting against. The United States dropped more bombs in Afghanistan in 2019 than any other year since the Pentagon began keeping a record in 2006. Data from U.S. Central Command shows U.S. warplanes dropped nearly 7,500 bombs and other munitions on Afghanistan last year, nearly 8 times more than in 2015. In Nicaragua, 6 indigenous environmental leaders were assassinated last week after a group of at least 80 armed men raided the Bosawas Biosphere Reserve, the second largest rainforest in the Americas after the Amazon. The attack is believed to be linked to raging land disputes between the local indigenous community and illegal loggers and miners who seek to exploit fertile land, timber, and gold. Another 10 indigenous leaders were also kidnapped during the violent raid. In Mexico, a second man linked to a monarch butterfly sanctuary in Michoacan has been assassinated. Raul Hernandez Romero's death comes just days after another slain conservationist body was discovered. Authorities are investigating the deaths and whether the men were targeted for their environmental activism. Friends and family of leading monarch conservationist Homero Gomez Gonzalez, whose body was found last week, attended his funeral on Friday. In Australia, dozens of koalas have been killed or injured at a timber plantation in the southeastern state of Victoria, where environmentalists say they were bulldozed in order to harvest the blue gum trees, a vital koala habitat. Australia's record-breaking bushfires have already killed tens of thousands of koalas and an estimated 1 billion animals since September. And in New York City, organizers say some 45 people were arrested Friday night after at least 1,000 New Yorkers took part in a protest calling out the policing and high cost of public transportation. The protest, which was met with a heavy police presence, was the third of its kind in recent months, following the announcement of a plan to add 500 police officers to subway stations around the city to clamp down on fare evasion. MTA data shows black and brown people are the most targeted by fare evasion policing. The city recently introduced a new reduced fare program known as Fair Fare, but critics say the cost is still prohibitive to many low-income New Yorkers. This is Mars, an activist with Decolonize This Place, one of the groups organizing the demonstrations.
People keep telling us to be civilized, to call your representative, your senators, but what we understand is that law isn't justice. And what we're asking for, again, is very simple. We want freeze transit, not a fair fare. What is this fair fare idea? If someone can't pay $275, what makes you think they could pay half the price? We asked for free fare, not fair fare. And I think that that's just a way for them to co-opt and silence movements, to give a select few benefits without giving it to all.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin with the Iowa caucuses, the official start of the 2020 presidential election season. Candidates spent the weekend making last-minute pitches to voters. On Saturday, Senator Bernie Sanders addressed 3,000 people at a rally in Cedar Rapids, in one of the largest rallies of the election season in Iowa.
We are taking on the entire political establishment, both the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment. We are taking on Wall Street and the insurance companies and the drug companies and the fossil fuel industry and the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex and the whole damn 1%.
On Saturday, former Vice President Joe Biden campaigned in North Liberty, Iowa.
Several of my colleagues in this race think it's naive of me to think we can bring the country together. I refuse to accept the notion that it's a forever war between Democrats and Republicans. It's not impossible. I've done it my whole career. They say I don't understand the new Republican Party. Well, you just got a glimpse of it. I understand the new Republican Party. I've been the object of their affection for a long while now. I wonder why. I wonder why. Oh, God love him, as my mother would say. Folks, I think it's pretty simple. They don't want me to be the nominee because they know I'll beat him like a drum. We will beat him.
On Sunday, Senator Elizabeth Warren campaigned in Indianola, Iowa.
Look, I get it in America. There are rich people, there are people who aren't rich. And rich people, they may own more shoes, they may own more cars, they may own more houses, but they're not supposed to own a bigger piece of our democracy. If we want to change that, we're not going to be able to do it with just a little nibble around the edge, one little statute over here, a couple of regulations over there. No, we want to beat back the influence of money. We want to save our democracy. We want to save our country. It's going to take big structural change. I got a plan for that.
In more news about the 2020 elections, the Democratic National Committee is coming under fire after overhauling debate requirements to eliminate the need for candidates to obtain a significant number of small donations, allowing billionaire Mike Bloomberg to take part in upcoming debates. Bernie Sanders' senior advisor, Jeff Weaver, on DNC debate rules said to now change the rules in the middle of the game to accommodate Mike Bloomberg, who is trying to buy his way into the Democratic nomination, is wrong. That's the definition of a rigged system, Weaver said. This comes as fear is growing among some Democrats that Bernie Sanders might win the nomination. Politico reports a small group of DNC members have begun discussing a proposal to increase the role of superdelegates to give the party establishment more say in who becomes the nominee. We go now to Des Moines, Iowa, where we're joined by John Nichols, the nation's national affairs correspondent, host of the podcast Next Left. He's on the ground covering the Iowa caucus, just wrote the piece, "The DNC's Move to Accommodate Bloomberg Stirs Outrage in Iowa." His forthcoming book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. John, it's great to have you on the ground in Iowa. So talk about this latest move of the DNC, the changing of the rules for who can participate in the debate.
Yes, the DNC set up some pretty strict rules last year. And there was a structure to it, but essentially you had to have a little bit of pole position and then you had to raise a substantial number of small contributions in order to get on the debate stage. And with each step of the process, they raised the number of contributions you needed and also raised the threshold for polls. That was what all the candidates who got in earlier last year, accepted. It's what they dealt with. Sometimes they complained about it, but those were the rules. Now, suddenly, on Friday, the DNC signaled that they want to get rid of the small donor rules and set a couple of poll thresholds around 10%. Or to say, if you got delegates in Iowa or New Hampshire, that you have to meet one of those standards to get into the Nevada debate and the debates going forward. Well, what's interesting about that is that in the past, when climate activists asked for a climate debate, they were told, well, you can't, that's not within the rules. When folks who wanted a poverty debate asked for a poverty debate, they said, no, you can't, that's not in the rules. When Cory Booker really challenged this process and said, look, you're going to end up with the potential of all-white debates in a party that has relied very heavily on African-American and Latino support, again, he was told, you can't change the rules. But now suddenly, they've changed the rules in a way that a lot of activists, and frankly other candidates, believe benefits Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, who got in the race late and who is skipping Iowa and New Hampshire in the early contests. And there's a tremendous amount of frustration with this because to an awful lot of folks, it looks like the rules are being changed to accommodate a billionaire, especially at a point when one candidate, Bernie Sanders, who's been campaigning against the billionaire class, seems to be rising.
I want to turn to Oscar-winning filmmaker, activist Michael Moore, speaking at a Bernie Sanders rally Friday night.
The fact that I'd have to wake up this morning and realize that we have to fight the corporate Democrats, the 1% of the Democratic Party who are thoroughly that Bernie Sanders is now #1, that Bernie Sanders might win this primary season, that Bernie Sanders might be the next president of the United States. They're so upset. They're like asking each other, how the hell did this happen? Bernie wasn't supposed to win. And so today they announced in this Hail Mary pass of theirs to try to undo the people's movement. They are removing the rule to be on the debate stage where it says you have to have so many people donating to you. Otherwise, instead of 27 people on the stage, there'd be 227 people on the stage. So you had to have a certain number of Americans that would give you a buck. That's all the rules said. But they would to show that there's support. And that's how they determined who would be on that debate stage. Today, they removed that rule because Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire, the Republican mayor of New York City, they're backstage going, oh God, what's he going to say? They removed it so that he could be in the next debate. He doesn't have to show he has any support amongst the American people. He can just buy his way onto the debate stage. And I got to tell you what's so disgusting about this. I watched the debate in Iowa here 2 weeks ago. The all-white debate. And the fact that the DNC will not allow Cory Booker on that stage, will not allow Julian Castro on that stage, but they're going to allow Mike Bloomberg on the stage because he's got $1 billion.
So that's Michael Moore speaking on Friday night in Clive, Iowa. The next night was the massive rally in Cedar Rapids of thousands. John, you were at both. Talk about his point and these rallies, the significance of what's happening and we don't usually cite polls, but right now it does look like Bernie Sanders is at the top.
Yeah, I mean, there's an incredible enthusiasm in Iowa, and also there's an incredible depth of awareness of the race. And so you saw at that rally, the mention of the DNC rule change, which maybe a lot of folks around America aren't following all that closely. In Iowa, it was not just a line that drew passionate responses. I mean, literally sustained booing and, angry responses. Is indicative of how seriously the people are taking this race and how seriously the Sanders people are. Sanders is running very well. I would always caution, and I know you sort of referenced it a moment ago, that polling of the Iowa caucuses is really hard because of the dynamics of the caucuses. So be very cautious about saying who's up or who's in front. But it's clear that Bernie Sanders is going to do very, very well here, and he could win. And the enthusiasm that's built up, you see it at those rallies, of course, and the rally in Cedar Rapids with the band Vampire Weekend just drew a massive crowd. And there are a lot of other speakers. Sanders spoke, but also Cornel West and others. The rally in Clive that you saw with Bon Iver, a very popular singer and very popular band, also had a lot of speakers. It was full of energy. It really was a mix of politics and culture. And these are big deal events, getting coverage. But Amy, I've been around the state the last week a lot, and I've gone to what should be small events at Sanders field office, in some small town in the basement of a building or something like that. And there'll be 100, 150 people at those events. And so there's clearly a incredible grassroots energy here. And to tie it back to the debate rule change, I think an awful lot of those grassroots activists get very, very frustrated by the notion that the rules might be changed in the midst of the game. And they don't just talk about Bernie Sanders. I've been struck. I was at an event in Grinnell, Iowa the other day and talking to a whole bunch of people, and it brought up the rule change. They were all aware of it, and they all brought up Cory Booker. There was a real sense that while Cory Booker never led the polls in Iowa, he really worked hard in this state, and he won a lot of interest, sympathy, and support. And he did drop out at a point where it was clear he wasn't going to get on those debate stages anymore. And there's a real consciousness that an African-American candidate who worked hard in Iowa, wanted to keep going, wanted to be in the debates, couldn't get an accommodation. But Mike Bloomberg, who's not campaigned in Iowa, appears to be getting an accommodation.
And of course, even Democrats who raise the issue of Bernie Sanders being a Democratic socialist, who's raising the issue of Bloomberg switching from being a Republican to
the
a Democrat.
Republican mayor. Yeah.
But let me ask you about what actually is happening tonight for people to understand what caucuses are, why people might go in and caucus with someone they might not necessarily support, someone who is not going to win, to then be freed up to go to see who's going to be the top candidate, to go over to that person's caucus.
Yeah, caucuses are complicated for people who don't live in Iowa and a couple other states that use them. Iowans really understand them quite well, so it's a kind of fascinating thing. And there's a lot of reasons to criticize caucuses. We may talk about that in a little bit. But the way a caucus works is this. At 7 o'clock tonight, actually people line up around 6:30, you go to a library or a school or a community hall in towns across Iowa, every little tiny town, the smallest place, and in precincts throughout cities. And you go with the people who live in your area, in your voting district. Some of these caucuses are huge. They will get hundreds of people in a college town, a place like that. Some of them are rather small. They're almost like in a living room or something. But at the 7 o'clock, they open the caucus, a caucus chair, calls it into session, if you will. They close the door so more people can't come in. And they ask people to kind of go to a corner in the room with the other folks that are for your candidate. So if you're for Sanders, you go to your corner. If you're for Warren, you go to your corner, Biden, Buttigieg, et cetera. And then you count who's in each corner or who's in each place. You have to have 15% of the people in the room to meet the so-called threshold for, kind of ultimately getting the delegate equivalence at this level. And if you don't have 15%, then you've fallen below what's referred to as viability. Now, the people who are with a viable candidate, say you're in a room where there's a lot of Bernie Sanders backers, and you're in your Bernie Sanders corner, you're locked in there. You can't move around to other candidates. But if you're with a non-viable candidate, somebody who didn't get to that threshold, then you become the most popular person in the room because the other campaigns all want you to come over. They get a higher level of delegate strength, ultimately, if you come to them. Or you can coalesce with other non-viables to form your own group. But the bottom line in the room is that everybody wants to come out with the most support. And frankly, nobody wants to leave without supporting somebody. So there's a lot of interest in, or at least a lot of attraction to joining a campaign that you might not have backed. And Amy, the best way to understand this is, let's say you show up and you're really excited about Andrew Yang, and you're excited that he's brought up a universal basic income, you're excited that he's talking about automation in ways that the other candidates aren't. But he doesn't get to the threshold in your room. So then you look around and maybe people from the other campaigns come up to you and say, hey, you know that Andrew Yang said something nice about Bernie Sanders, or you know that Elizabeth Warren's talking about big structural change and that might fit with some of what you're discussing, et cetera. And so you go with one of the others. Let's say you go with Sanders. You and other people from that Yang group going with Sanders could really boost Sanders to an even stronger position coming out of your caucus and ultimately statewide.
Didn't Yang say supporters can move to Bernie Sanders if their caucus sites don't meet the threshold for Yang? Mm-hmm.
He has, although he's sort of, pulled back and forth on that because, one of the challenges on this thing is you do want your backers to get there and you do want them to be as strong for you as possible. But yeah, Yang has said some nice things. And frankly, there's been speculation that Amy Klobuchar, who has a substantial amount of support but might not meet thresholds, that her people might go with another so-called moderate candidate like a Biden or a Buttigieg. And so all of the campaigns have trained their caucus leaders to work that angle, to work really, really hard. And to give you a sense of how much this has moved up the political ladder, yesterday I was with Elizabeth Warren at an event in Ames, and she opened up with a very long soliloquy about how much she liked the other candidates and how much she had learned from them and how much they had contributed. And the telegraphing there was, if you show up at a caucus and maybe your candidate's not doing very well, Elizabeth Warren really likes your candidate or really is sympathetic and will listen. That was a very smart thing for Elizabeth Warren to do. And you're hearing it from other candidates as well. They really do want to kind of pull these folks together, at least in the caucus.
Very quickly, John, could there be multiple winners tonight?
Absolutely. The rules are complex. And so when they do that initial count in the room, right, you'll get a report on that. And so somebody might do pretty well in the initial counts but not meet the threshold, so they'll point to that. But ultimately, the big thing people will look at is the delegate equivalence, what it comes out at the end, who's kind of moving up that ladder. And so that'll probably be the main winner. But remember something else, Amy, that in Iowa, coming in second can mean a lot. If Bernie Sanders comes in first and Elizabeth Warren comes in second, that's going to be very powerful for Elizabeth Warren because she drifted down a little in the polls. If somebody unexpected, let's say Buttigieg, who has had big rallies and big events, let's say he comes in first, that's huge for him. And then it might be rough for Sanders because many people expected him to come in first. So there's a lot of tea leaf reading as you get late into tonight and early tomorrow morning.
Well, of course, we're going to be bringing people results tomorrow on Democracy Now! John Nichols, please stay with us because we want to ask you about impeachment. You wrote a book about it. What's next? John Nichols is the nation's national affairs correspondent. Then we'll talk about the expanding Muslim ban and what is Trump's approach to the coronavirus. Stay with us.
My body shake and cast your sleeping hearts away. Could it tremble stars from moonlit skies? Could it drag a tear from your cold eyes? I live on the right side, I sleep on the left. That's why everything has gotta be love or death. Yes, this fear's got a hold on me.
by white lies. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The Republican-controlled Senate appears poised to acquit President Trump in just the third impeachment trial in U.S. history. The Senate scheduled a final vote on the 2 articles of impeachment for Wednesday. On Friday, the Senate voted 51 to 49 against calling witnesses to be in the Senate trial. Just 2 Republican senators supported calling for witnesses and collecting new evidence, Senator Mitt Romney of Utah and Susan Collins of Maine. Prior to the vote, President Trump's personal lawyer, Jay Sekulow, said there was no need to call witnesses.
So this idea that they haven't had witnesses, that's the smokescreen. You've heard from a lot of witnesses. The problem with the case, the problem with their position is, even with all of those witnesses, it doesn't prove up an impeachable offense. The articles fail. The record that the managers told us was overwhelming and complete. Mr. Schiff went through every sentence of the articles of impeachment just a few days ago and said, proved, proved, proved. The problem is what it prove is not an impeachable offense.
After the vote on witnesses, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said the Senate did not live up to its responsibilities.
To not allow a witness, a document, no witnesses, no documents in an impeachment trial is a perfidy. It's a grand tragedy, one of the worst tragedies that the Senate has ever overcome. America will remember this day, unfortunately, where the Senate did not live up to its responsibilities, where the Senate turned away from truth and went along with a sham trial.
The Senate trial will resume today at 11 a.m. Eastern for 4 hours of arguments. The final vote is scheduled for 4 p.m. on Wednesday, a day after President Trump gives his State of the Union address. Democracy Now! Will be live streaming at democracynow.org, the Senate impeachment trial. Still with us, John Nichols of The Nation, author of many books, including The Genius of Impeachment, The Founder's Cure for Royalism. John, respond to the latest. So the vote has taken place. You even had Lamar Alexander, who supposedly was on the fence, the Republican from Tennessee. He said that he thought the House managers did prove their case. He just felt that this was not the way to remove the president. The election is. Talk about this and what's about to happen, and if you could see anything unpredictable taking place.
I am not expecting a lot of unpredictable developments today. Obviously, what we're looking for in these speeches might be an indication from the 2 Republicans who voted for hearing witnesses of what they're thinking. You also want to look at a couple of Democrats who might split their vote on impeachment, vote for one article, vote against another because they come from more conservative states. There are some twists and turns in there that might arise. But at the end of the day, we, by all accounts, appear to be heading toward a Senate vote to acquit Donald Trump. And it will probably be quite overwhelming in the context of the thing because the Republicans will hold together. We've learned a lot from this. We've learned that the Republican Party has really become pretty much a pure reflection of Donald Trump. There's a little bit of dissent, you mentioned it, but it's not what we had in, say, the Watergate days, for instance. And this is a big deal because impeachment is supposed to be this, in my opinion, wonderful tool that allows us to hold presidents account in the midst of their terms. And it's clearly undermined when you have such a high level of partisanship that the chamber that's supposed to try the impeached president really effectively won't do so. The other thing, though, is that I always remind people that don't look for too many unpredictable things in the next day or so, but do understand that impeachment has multiple meanings and multiple layers. And while we have never, ever had a president convicted at trial in an impeachment trial, we have often had presidents who are held to account by popular opinion, by elections, not their own elections. Trump will be the first to run for re-election as an impeached president, and also by history. And so I don't think this story is done by any means, but I do think that the formal structures of it will be done in a few days. And I encourage people to keep watching it and paying close attention, because this is really an exercise of the people's constitutional authority, even if some of their politicians may thwart it.
John, it's interesting that you're watching the impeachment from the beginning of the elections, right? The first caucus state, and that is Iowa. Your piece was headlined, "Donald Trump's defense would make the president a king." Explain.
Sure. I was really, really troubled by a lot of the arguments made by the president's defense team. Not the kind of over-the-top things you might hear from a Ken Starr or an Alan Dershowitz, but the arguments made by, the more suit and tie, formal, lawyerly members of the team. And what was incredibly troubling to me was that they were arguing that if you agreed to an abuse of power charge against the president, that somehow you were extending the meaning of impeachment, that somehow you were making it into something it wasn't intended to be. That was exactly the wrong argument. That was false. And the truth is that impeachment was created specifically to address abuses of power. They were also suggesting that somehow the authority to impeach, the power to do so, didn't really rest fully with the House. Yeah, the House could do it, but they really should be going to the courts and doing other things. Again, that's not how this has been understood historically. And so what was troubling to me was that they were arguing for a new definition of impeachment that essentially makes impeachment impossible. And if impeachment is impossible, if it really is something that will never happen, then we get to a point where future presidents will not cooperate with the Congress in any way, as this president essentially did not, and where they will feel an immense amount of freedom to do as they please, because they genuinely believe there's a precedent that says they will never be held to account. That gets us to exactly what the founders of the American experiment, imperfect as they were, feared the most, and that was that a president might serve as a king for 4 years, and that king for 4 years might abuse his position to win a second term. And so this is a very, very unsettling point at which to be, because so much of what was put forward by the Trump defense team really attacks not just the arguments against Trump, but attacks the basic concept that we can hold presidents to account.
John Nichols, I want to thank you for being with us, Nation's national affairs correspondent on the ground in Iowa, and just wrote the piece, which we will link to. The DNC's move to accommodate Bloomberg stirs outrage in Iowa. His new book coming out soon, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. We will also be live streaming the impeachment Senate trial today, starting at 11 Eastern, and also on Wednesday. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we move on now to the new travel ban. That's right. The Trump administration has expanded its contested travel ban to 6 additional countries, most of which are African nations. Under the new restrictions, nationals of Nigeria, Eritrea, Burma, Kyrgyzstan will no longer be able to obtain visas to live and work in the U.S., while nationals of Sudan and Tanzania will no longer be able to participate in the diversity visa lottery. The ban, commonly referred to as the Muslim ban, already affects citizens from Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Venezuela, and North Korea. The expansion is expected to affect more than 350 million people. Democrats say they will challenge the new ban and are expected to introduce the No Ban Act in Congress soon. The latest travel ban takes effect February 22nd. For more, we're joined by Omar Jadwa, the director of ACLU's Immigrant Rights Project. The ACLU has been challenging the Trump administration's Muslim ban since the first ban was announced in January 2017. The ACLU won rulings against all 3 prior versions of the ban, blocking it until the Supreme Court allowed it to go into effect. They're still litigating against it today. The Fight, a Sundance Film Festival film, is also chronicles the fight of the ACLU around the travel ban. Omar, it's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us. Explain what the Trump administration just laid out, as people are hardly paying attention.
Sure.
Between the impeachment, between the Iowa caucuses, what's just happened?
So essentially what's happened is they've taken the Muslim ban. They've doubled down on that Muslim ban by extending it further, right? Remember, this was supposed to be a temporary measure. Even when he promised the Muslim ban, it was supposed to be until they figured out what the hell was going on. Well, they still haven't figured it out 3 years later, right? So we have that original Muslim ban continuing, and we've essentially added on top of it a ban on Africans. A quarter of the people who live on the African continent are now live in countries that are now subject to the expanded ban. And so what we see here is the president going...
Wait, say that again. A quarter of the African continent, of the population of Africa, will now be under...
live in a country where they're going to be affected in one way or another by the ban. And so, you know, and remember, President Trump, we've all recalled the things he said about Muslims in the election campaign.
And we all recall what he said about Africa, African countries,
right.
those,
Nigerians,
I won't say
right?
it, S-hole
who are
countries.
The biggest group affected by the expansion of the ban. He said would never go back to their huts if we allowed them to come to the United States, right? And so we just see him going from one prejudice to another, from one racist version of this ban to an expanded racist version of this ban. And that's where we are today.
So how does it affect countries and people who have already received visas?
So people who have a visa right now are kind of grandfathered in. They can use that visa. But it affects going forward people who may have been in the process of waiting in line for visas for years, right? So you have people, and we've seen this with the existing ban, people who have family members, people in the United States who have family members abroad, spouses, fiancés, brothers, sisters, grandmas, who can't come, even though they qualify entirely for visas under the law.
So let's take a country like Burma. You have the International Court of Justice that has just ordered Burma to take all measures within its power to protect Rohingya Muslims from genocide. The court issued the ruling last week, the week before, calling the 600,000 Rohingya remaining in Burma extremely vulnerable to military violence. Now, no one from Burma can seek political asylum in the United States?
Well, if they manage to get here, they can seek asylum. But of course, the way many people come to seek asylum in the United States is they come on a visa and then they seek asylum. So, so parts of that route will no longer be available to people from Burma. But again, I mean, if you look at the numbers and you look at the way that this ban has currently shaped, it's very much a reflection of the president's prejudice, specifically against Muslims and Africans.
Nigeria has the 6th largest Christian population in the world. It also has the 5th largest Muslim population. So how is the ACLU, how is this being dealt with?
Right. So we have an ongoing case against the ban as it stood, or as it continues to stand, the core of the ban that's been in place for three years now. And so we are continuing. We actually just had an argument in that case last week. Even though the Supreme Court obviously dealt us a significant setback when it allowed the ban to move forward, that case is still ongoing, and we will continue to litigate that case vigorously. And it's our view that at the end of the day, we will be able to establish that, notwithstanding everything that's happened to date, notwithstanding the fact that we've had to live under this ban for years, that we will show at the end of the day that it's unconstitutional.
Explain the Trump administration's rationale here.
Well, their rationale is that these countries, they say, do not share enough information with the United States so that we can vet their citizens when they come. And before the first ban came into place, sure, there were countries where we vetted people more strongly because we didn't necessarily think the country sent enough information. But we did the vetting, and we never had these per-country bans on this kind of a basis, right? And it's clear that the ban, this whole rationale was reverse engineered to fit what the president wanted to do, right? As Rudy Giuliani said, Muslim ban, let me tell you how to do it legally, right? And so he said he wanted a ban, they came up with this basis, and now they're using that same basis to expand it and go after other groups.
Omar, can you explain the No Ban Act in Congress?
Sure. So the No Ban Act would really restrict the ability of this president or any other president to use the power that he's relying on in the law to go after groups of people. And so, it's an important reform to our immigration laws because the way that the Supreme Court understood the law is giving the president great power to basically enact whatever he thinks the restrictions ought to be on people who can come to the country.
Omar Jadwa, I want to thank you for being with us. We'll continue to follow this. Director of the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project. The ACLU has been challenging the Trump administration's Muslim bans since the first ban was announced January 2017, winning rulings against all three prior versions of the ban, blocking it until the Supreme Court allowed it to go into effect. They're still litigating against it today. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett joins us. She has written a new piece about the coronavirus. Stay with us. To Hell with Poverty by Gang of Four. Founding member and guitarist Andy Gill died in London Saturday at the age of 64. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak, which has already claimed the lives of at least 361 people in China. It's believed 17,000 people are now infected. As the virus continues to spread, the United States has declared a public health emergency and is barring foreign nationals who've recently traveled to China from entering the U.S. So far, there are 11 confirmed cases of the virus in the U.S. A 44-year-old man in the Philippines became the first fatality of the disease outside China Saturday. And over the weekend, the number of confirmed cases worldwide continued to grow, in more than 2 dozen countries. Most of these cases are in China. U.S. citizens who visited Hubei province, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, will be quarantined when re-entering the country. Questions are being raised about the handling of the disease by Chinese authorities, who critics say delayed their response and downplayed the severity of the problem. The local Red Cross in Hubei has also come under fire for failing to distribute essential medical supplies to hospitals which need it most. Meanwhile, Chinese and Asian countries and communities and countries, including France and Canada, have become the target of increased racism, they say, because of the outbreak. For more, we're joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laurie Garrett, author of several books, including Ebola, Story of an Outbreak, and the Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, and Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health. Her latest piece for Foreign Policy is headlined, Trump has sabotaged America's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Laurie. It's great to have you with us. Explain what you found.
Well, the Trump administration, from the moment it came in, wanted to disband programs that were signature programs of the Obama administration. One of them had to do with global health security in response to the 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, which, as you know, was a very deadly outcome and involved 3 countries. The United States played a big role, including having our military on site in Liberia in support. And the Trump administration pretty much disbanded the entire program, got rid of the National Security Council's Special Pandemic Response Unit, got rid of the equivalent in the Department of Homeland Security, cut the budget of the Centers for Disease Control, and we can go down a huge list. Even a program that is specifically aiming at protecting you and me, citizens inside the country, by beefing up the hospital capacities and training of local healthcare workers and public health leaders is running out of money and will be officially shut down in May unless something happens. And Congress has refused to even look at it. McConnell has never allowed it to even come up for a vote. So we're in a situation now where we're flying on fumes with people in charge who've never really been in the middle of epidemics, haven't listened to those who really understand how to stop an epidemic. And then on top of it all, Pompeo, the Secretary of State, seems to be to have carte blanche to do whatever he wants. He's not consulting other agencies before acting. And so he has basically banned not only a travel ban on people coming from China to the United States, but he's conflated our immigration policy with a travel issue so that if you're a Chinese citizen now, you can't come to the United States. Most Americans don't realize they've essentially used this epidemic to stop all travel and movement. And one of the outcomes of that, which is just incredibly nuts, is that almost all of the active pharmaceutical ingredients used in the formulation of medicines in America, frankly, for the whole world, come from China. And so we will soon run out of drugs for everything. Has nothing to do with the epidemic. We're going to run out of diabetes drugs and heart disease drugs and cancer drugs and all of that, many of which were already in short supply because the ingredients our pharmaceutical industry uses all come from China.
And what's going to happen to all of those drugs being made in China?
Who knows? There's no answer, there's no solution, and now the tension between the United States and China has gotten so high that the Foreign Ministry issued statements today declaring that America is responsible for a global xenophobic attack against China. And in no uncertain terms, it's very clear that inside China, it's already beginning to play as America is our enemy. America is making it worse for us.
What do you think of, on Thursday, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, appearing to welcome the coronavirus as a boost to the U.S. job market, saying in a Fox News interview that it would, quote, accelerate the return of jobs to North America?
Well, that was ill-advised comment, to say the least. And look, we're going to have other comments of a similar tone. We right now here in New York City have 3 suspected cases of this virus. All involve individuals who'd recently been in China. All over the United States, we're seeing cases of individuals that have been in China. And many of them are ethnic Chinese, so you may feed a kind of racial response, a kind of xenophobia that is always in America, just, this close to the surface. Give it a little scratch and boom, out comes the racism. So I think we're in very dangerous territory right now where we need not only infrastructure guidance, but moral guidance in how to respond to a frightening epidemic.
Apparently, as part of the restrictions now in the U.S., some flights are being rerouted to specific airports where passengers receive advanced health screenings.
Yes, this is a playbook that follows what happened in 2009 with the H1N1 swine flu. When it went global, everybody goes to shutting down their airports as if that matters, as if that works. One of the things that's really a problem with this virus that wasn't with SARS, even though they're very, very close genetically, it's a crucial biological difference.
The SARS virus from what year was that?
2003. And I was in the middle of that epidemic in China throughout, so I know what I'm speaking of. And in that particular epidemic, we were fortunate that people were really only contagious when they had a high fever. And so this thing you see all over China now of these fever guns pointing at people's heads to see, do you have a fever? And if you do, sending you off to quarantine has become the method used all over the world. So now we set up these fever portals that you walk through at airports.
Detect your temperature?
Detect your temperature. And all over the world now, people have erected them in their airports. But the problem is, we now know this virus can spread before you have any symptoms at all. And so the person carrying the virus might not have a fever. So we're setting up a whole false sense of defense.
So let's go back, Lori. Explain what is happening in China right now. In fact, explain what the coronavirus is, and then what we're seeing, over 360 deaths, 17,000 people. Overwhelmingly, it's China that's being hit the hardest.
Yes. Coronavirus is called corona because it has spikes around the outside, which, when you look at it through a microscope, kind of looks like a crown. Corona crown. But that has nothing to do with its biology, just what it looks like. It's a class of viruses that includes most of your common colds. So actually everybody's quite familiar with coronaviruses, they just don't know it. And all the dangerous coronaviruses that we have seen in recent years, the big ones being the current one, SARS and MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is still circulating in Saudi Arabia. All of them are originally bat viruses. Now, not vampire bats, but fruit bats. And because of pressures we're putting on bat habitats, particularly rainforests, bats are more and more going into areas where there's human occupation, even though they're very shy creatures. Somewhere in the chain of wildlife hunting and transport and then sale of live animals in wet markets in China, bats come in contact with some other intermediary species. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it's camels. In the case of SARS, it was the civet, which is eaten in winter, ironically to ward off respiratory infections, and it was the carrier that transmitted to humans. And in the case of this disease, we don't yet know what species in the wet market was the intermediary animal, which is very scary because it means that species still in sale and circulation elsewhere in Asia may be spreading the virus to human beings. Meanwhile, once it's jumped to human beings, what we're looking at is a virus that causes really severe pneumonia. That's your top dangerous symptom. And we don't have any treatment for it except to put you on oxygen intensive care treatment to help you fight your own pneumonia. Since it's a viral pneumonia, of course, antibiotics cannot be used, should not be used.
What about a vaccine? There
is no vaccine. We don't have a vaccine for any of the coronaviruses. And there is a lot of evidence that as people are infected for a while, they make antibodies against the virus. They do manage to eventually clear it in most cases, but the antibodies are not lasting. So they don't remain immune over time, which bodes ill for developing an effective vaccine.
So what's happening with people? How did China deal with it? How are they dealing with it? What's happening in Wuhan?
The way China has responded is to draw on its 2003 SARS playbook, and the similarities are just enormous from what I saw with SARS, because SARS started in November 2002, wasn't really detected until cases fled across the border into Hong Kong. And suddenly, Hong Kong's hospitals were being filled with these mysterious cases. But China was denying that it was a mainland China problem, denying that it had gone beyond the original outbreak zone down in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, and covered up the existence of the virus in Beijing, where it was being handled secretly by the military and cases were being put in military hospitals. When they finally had to admit, yes, we have a problem, people fled, and I was there as an eyewitness. They fled by the tens of thousands from Beijing by every means possible. And overnight, it was an all-nation epidemic. So the only way to control it was to say everybody gets a fever check at every highway point, every entry to every public building, and so on. And they're now just replicating the same thing, building instant hospitals, barricades, blocking off cities, blocking off transport.
In part two, we'll post at democracynow.org what people can do about it. Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist Laurie Garrett. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.